Darth Vadent, or is it Darth Vadent? I don't know. Asks, what do you think of War Corp 666? He's a really goofy idiot, is what he is. Like, I mean, his Atari 2600 game collection looks decent. I know Atari games are cheap in the US, but, I mean, he's just a goofball. Like, he looks funny, he's dumb as shit. Like, he has that, like, wacky thing with the clocks in the background. Like, he tries to make it look like he's an official professional news thing with all the different clocks of the different time zones, and it just doesn't work at all. He just looks like a total fucking goofball. Are you planning on expanding the channel in any specific way? I don't really know. Like, what should I do? If I monetize my videos, like, I've thought about it. Because apparently Jason Unruh makes a bunch of money. He has like 20,000 subs. I have like 2,500. If I could get like even $10 a month, I mean that would be something. Like after a couple of months I could use that to buy like a microphone. I don't know if I should do that. Apart from that, like improve production value by buying a better microphone, professional editing software. You know, I'm always getting better at editing, I'm getting better at speaking English, I learn more about things. So I think that's already improving the channel a little bit. Like if you look at my old videos, the editing is not so good, and the sound quality is really shit, like in the old videos. So I think I have improved. Actually, just give me suggestions, like how would you want to see this channel be expanded? Like I'm gonna do more solo videos, I'm gonna do more collab videos with other people. I'm gonna do theory videos, I'm gonna do video responses, you know, serious videos, funny videos, like all kinds of stuff. Thoughts on Hoxha and the anti-revisionist, anti-Maoist tendency among Marxist-Leninists, and how old are you? I am 23. But yeah, thoughts on Hoxha and the anti-revisionist, anti-Maoist tendency among Marxist-Leninists. I sort of understand what it's coming from, like what reasoning behind it is, but I don't really like it. Well, I do to a certain degree, because I'm not a Maoist either, so... You know, I consider Maoists my comrades, I consider Hoxhists my comrades. Like, I don't have big problems with either of those schools of thought. I think Hoxhists tend to be people who don't think about these things in a very nuanced way. I don't like the huge anti-Mao tendency, because I'm definitely pro-Mao myself. But, on the other hand, I'm not a Maoist. But the thing is, I've also noticed that we have different reasons for not being Maoists. Like, I'm not a Maoist because I don't see Maoism as a new development of Marxism-Leninism. I recognize Mao's contribution to it, but I don't see it as a new ideology. Hoxhists, on the other hand, just seem to think that Maoism was horrible. Like, a lot of the arguments that Hoxhists make about Mao just don't make any sense. They attack him for being revisionist later on, which is, you know, okay, you can do that, but that doesn't discredit Maoism. They point out that China had some private property, which is true, but to me that's almost an ultra-left thing to say, that China waged a anti-imperialist struggle against Japan, and the patriotic people in the country, together with the communists, helped defeat the invader. Like, it would be pretty difficult to, after that, just turn around and take everything from the petty bourgeoisie and the patriotic people who collaborated with the communists. Basically, the Soviet Union collectivized everything before there was a war. But China, on the other hand, had a united front during the war, and that's why they also needed a united front policy for after the war. In China, imperialism played a bigger part, so basically foreign capitalism versus China was a bigger element than Chinese capitalists versus Chinese workers. So yeah, I mean, China had a small amount of private property still in existence, which they would have gotten rid of in time, but that's perfectly understandable. You know, the Soviet Union, it took them like more than a decade to get rid of private property. William Robinson asks, what are your views on the Maoist Communist Party of China? That is the one that was formed a decade ago. I'm not an expert, but it seems good. Like, it sounds good that they have a Maoist party in China. But I'm not an expert. I don't know any of their specific policies or anything, but I support the general idea of it. Bakuninist guy, whose name I can't pronounce, asks, do you believe the Germans turned Jews into lampshades and bars of soap? Thing is that this guy is like a massive Nazi. He's like a Bakuninist anarchist, but he's like a massive anti-Semite, so he's like, oh, the Germans wouldn't do anything bad to the Jews, while he also hates the Jews and wants to kill them all. Did they turn them into lampshades and bars of soap? Like, I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past them. Haven't really looked into it, but, I mean, I seriously wouldn't put it fucking past them. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that that kind of fucked up shit has been done. Like, people have been making, you know, human flesh into leather for quite a long time. Like, even the American slave owners did that to black people. Like, lampshades sound more like a luxury item. So, I mean, they might do that just because they're fucked up, like, the slave owners also did that. But that's more of a luxury product, so it doesn't sound as likely, but, I mean, I still believe it. Bars of soap, I mean, it sounds probable because it's war, everything is super scarce, so I think it sounds rather likely they would have done that. Okay, my good buddies from the Hammer and Sickle ask, why do you think we never hear of the African socialist states? A lot of them happened kind of late, like in the late 70s, late 80s even, and they were short-lived, almost immediately crushed by imperialists. And probably because they were so far away, that's another thing. So they were smaller, more like far away, short-lived. Those are some of the reasons that I can think of. I don't know if you have any other reasons that you're thinking about, but... like, the most successful one was Burkina Faso, and that's, like, the one that most people know about, I think. Like, that's the most famous one. And Burkina Faso was great for 4 years. They achieved so much, but then the president was assassinated, and there was a coup, and then it just all went to shit. But, like, if you think about the other ones, all the other ones were crushed pretty quickly. The only two that I can think of that actually survived for a protracted amount of time, there's Angola. They won the civil war against the right-wing mercenaries and against the South African apartheid regime's invasion into Angola. Then there's, of course, Zimbabwe, and then there's South Africa itself after, like, Nelson Mandela became the president. So there's those 3 countries. Those are, like, the ones where the supposedly left-wing governments are still in power, but they've all become, like, super social democrat and, like, corrupt instead of actually Marxist. Like, in the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, I think all of them just kind of were like, well, we're fucked. I mean, let's not go socialist then. Let's just go, like, social democrat or something. Like, let's just try reformism. I think in the 90s, they didn't have the balls to just be militant anymore, so they went reformist. So they're now kind of shit. Like, Zimbabwe is more like an anti-imperialist country. It's an independent country, but it's not necessarily even that left-wing. Angola is like a more left-wing country, but not socialist. So there's not a lot of them that survived for a long time. I think that's a problem. Do you think Marxists should ally with the quote-unquote SJW community in the name of countering the anti-feminist sentiment here on the internet? I don't know about allying with them, and I don't know exactly what counts as an SJW, but, I mean, if there's people countering anti-feminism, then, yeah, I mean, we should counter anti-feminism. So I'm not saying that we should support every SJW, whatever that means. I'm just saying that if there's people who are countering anti-feminism, then, we should support them at least to a degree. Like, if they agree with us on countering anti-feminism, but they're totally horrible in other ways, then maybe not, but depending on the situation and within reason, if these people, if they're liberals, for example, if they agree with us on some things but not all things, that's still better than them not agreeing on anything. Technician666 asks, opinions on Putin's Russia and anti-imperialism. Well, Putin is a scumbag. He's a right-winger, a right-wing capitalist, strongman. But occasionally he happens to do the right thing just because, like, he helps the people who don't like America. Because America is the worst. Like, America is basically the fucking devil. If I believed in God like Hugo Chavez did, I would say the same thing. Like, he said that the US was the great Satan. The US is the most evil regime on the planet. And because Russia happens to do a rather good job of fucking with them, they are oftentimes in the right. Like, they support Donetsk, and even though Donetsk is not perfect and socialist, at least they want independence from fucking Nazi Ukraine. And the US supports the Nazis, Russia supports Donetsk. Now, Russia doesn't support Donetsk because Russia is like a good altruistic country, or because Putin's government is like an altruistic government. They do it because they want to secure their own interests and fuck with the US. But it's still the right thing to do. They're doing it for selfish reasons, but it's still the right thing to do. Same, like, they support Syria against US aggression and against US-backed mercenaries. That's the right thing to do. They just do it for selfish reasons, but it's still the right thing to do. Putin is not an anti-imperialist. He's just a rival imperialist. But in this weird situation that we're living in, he happens to pretty often do the right thing, but for wrong reasons. Callum Wilson asks, how do we best fight anti-communist propaganda when it's so deep-rooted in the West, America to be precise? Well, that's the question, ain't it? We just have to tell people what communism is. People don't even know. They just have this irrational fear drilled into their heads. They don't even know what it is. We just have to give them the facts. Like, if I were to give you a bunch of things that I've learned from actually talking to people, it's good to know specific facts. Like, just know your history, know your theory. In debates, history is oftentimes more important than theory. But it's important to also know about theory, because then you can actually explain why the Soviet Union, for example, did things the way they did. You can explain why they had autonomous regions and why they had these republics and all that, because of the national question. You can explain why communism didn't become stateless. You can explain it through the withering away of the state theory. You can explain what the dictatorship of the proletariat really means. You can explain what kind of democracy they had. So, a lot of it is just debunking bullshit, basically, because people have been fed lies for so long. I don't think you can convince everyone, obviously, but you can convince people to basically grow our numbers, and then when there's more people, we can just keep doing that and expand more. And at some point, I think communism will become sort of a mainstream big thing in the West as well. Like, I think it can happen. It happened before, and I think it can happen again. Like, that's sort of my main strategy right now anyway. Like, you can debate about, like, should we use violence? Should we use legal means or illegal means, or participate in elections, or should we not? Depends a lot on your country, but no matter what, we still need to recruit more people. So, especially in the West, where communism is so small, recruit. Get more people into this thing. Yeah, know your theory, know your history. It's good to know specific dates and years, I think, and it's good to know actual statistics as well, like how much the life expectancy increased in the Soviet Union, how much the literacy rate increased. Basically, there's just a whole lot of facts you should know. Okay, Demo asks, thoughts on the CPGB-ML? The CPGB-ML seems like the best party in the UK, at least in England. Maybe for Northern Ireland, they might want to have something different, because republicanism is so big there. They might want to go with the Republican Socialist Party or something, but CPGB-ML certainly seems like the best party. I don't really have that many big disagreements with the CPGB-ML. They support modern China a lot, maybe a little bit more than I would, but I have mixed feelings about the Scotland thing, because the CPGB-ML opposed Scottish independence, because they said that Scotland wasn't a proper nation, that it doesn't need national autonomy or secession. I'm kind of torn about that, because territorially, economically, and historically they are very much the same as Britain, and they have the same language too, so it just comes down to, are they a separate culture or not? Do they have a separate culture? And that's a really hard question to answer. Yeah, I mean, they have their own differences, but is it enough to warrant secession? From a purely theoretical standpoint, I don't really know. If the UK was entirely socialist, I wouldn't want them to secede, obviously. But I still support Scottish independence, because the Brits deserve it, basically. I mean, I have nothing against British people, really, but, I mean, the UK capitalists deserve it. They should secede and have independence just because it's gonna mess with British capitalists and British imperialism. Twips asks, what are your thoughts on China with a communistic economy projected to surpass America's economy by 2030? And do you think communism is the reason for their successful economy? And why isn't this talked about in mainstream media? It's talked about sometime, but, I don't know. I don't think that's the thing people want to hear, so that's probably why. China's economy is not really that communistic. It's state capitalism. It's not communistic, really. But is communism the reason for their success? To a large degree, yes. One thing's for sure, if it wasn't for Mao, and if it wasn't for communism, then China wouldn't be a successful country today. China would be a total shithole. China used to be way poorer than India, when Mao came to power. Now, India is much poorer than China. So, I mean, there's that. So yeah, they definitely needed communism for their success to happen, but, I mean, state capitalism works also. So, communism helped a lot and it was necessary for their success, but state capitalism also gives them a lot of economic gain. So, yeah, to a large degree, communism was the reason for their success. The ultra-leftist asks, thoughts on Councilism and Situationism? I assume Councilism is the same as Council Communism. Council Communism I don't like it because it's decentralized. It doesn't really make that much sense. It's about Soviets, basically. Soviets, in my idea, are meant to be dual power, struggle instruments. They're supposed to be instruments of class struggle against the capitalist government. So you do that, you overthrow the government, then you get your own government, your own worker state. Then the Soviets will be co-opted into the state. They will become the new state. But what council communists and anarchists and all kinds of ultra-lefts like to talk about, they want these Soviets and these things to be independent of the state. They want them to be separate from the state. When in reality, they are the state. That's what the whole idea of a Soviet republic is. They had the Supreme Soviet, which was the parliament. They had the local Soviets, which were the local instruments of political power. They had the poor peasant committees, which were exclusively for poor peasants. And then they had the village Soviets, which were the rural Soviets. So those things are effectively the state. But council communists seem to think that these things don't need to be together in any kind of a state structure, that they just need to be separate and totally independent, and it's just going to be a decentralized mess. This goes back to my problem with anarchism in general, and like all kinds of left communism and anarchism and things like that. You can look at the failures of the Soviet Union, you can see the corruption of the revisionist era, and you can look at the over-centralization of the Stalin era, and you can look at it honestly and see what it was, and you can look at those mistakes. But what on earth makes you go like, oh, that means Marxism-Leninism as a whole doesn't work? I don't understand that at all. Okay, they did these kinds of mistakes, and they did these kinds of mistakes. Let's just do the same thing, but just fix those mistakes. You don't have to be like, it's all just not gonna work. Like, let's just try this totally different thing which seems so much more unlikely to work, Like, have a nuanced approach to Leninism rather than this stupid, rejection of the entire thing. Basically, it seems to me that these new ideologies, like council communism, and these people, they seem to think that there's a magic fix for the system. It's like, oh, there's corruption and abuse of political power, so therefore we just invent this new ideology which somehow is like a magical fix for everything, and then this won't happen again. No, corruption happens in every system. The only way you can actually get rid of corruption and the abuse of political power, so that it's theoretically never going to happen, is if you get rid of political power as a whole. And you can only do that in full communism. But the big question, of course, is how do we get there? Because you can't make it, you can't create it artificially, prematurely either, like anarchists have tried to do. So there's no magical fix for these things. The only way you can actually do this is just to do Marxism-Leninism and then just learn from mistakes, fix those mistakes. It's not about the failure of the system or the failure of the theory. It's about the failure of execution. The execution is the problem. Okay, situationism is a theory about doing revolution. And I don't really like that either. I don't agree with it. It doesn't really make sense to me. Situationism is this idea that there's just a certain situation which gives rise to a revolutionary subject, like the party or something. There's the Bolshevik party before the revolution, and then Lenin says, let's have a revolution, and then somehow it turns into a revolutionary subject that just overcomes the odds and just against all odds wins the revolution. To a certain degree, that kind of analysis makes sense. They kind of did win against all odds. Cuba is the best example of this. They did this crazy Focoism and they still won. So it's kind of crazy. It's kind of insane. But they weren't stupid about it. It was Marxism-Leninism. It was guerrilla war. It had some similarities to People's War. I think all of their military mistakes were due to Che's Focoism, and all of their successes were in spite of it, and due to correct tactics of Marxism-Leninism and guerrilla war and all kinds of things like that. So, situationism to me seems like a way to understand these things after they've happened, but it seems kinda useless for actually determining when is a good time for a revolution. Because based on situationism, you could say that we got nothing, but let's just overthrow the government now and we'll just overcome all the odds and win. No, that's not gonna happen. Okay, cultural Marxism isn't real asks, what's your thoughts on the mass line? I agree with the mass line. The mass line is the Maoist theory that we find out what the people want, what the people's political consciousness is at this very moment. It's gonna be contradictory and it's gonna be unclear, and they don't have the theoretical knowledge, they don't necessarily have the economic knowledge. Talk to random people on the street, they don't necessarily know. So You just gather up all that information and then you formulate that into a actual strategy of how do we do things. And then you project that back into the people. You go tell people this is what we need to do. So I agree with that. But again, like this goes back to my problem with Maoism as a whole. I don't think this is an exclusively Maoist idea, to be honest. Like, let's be real. Like, Mao came up with this fancy term for it, mass line. But did Mao really invent this concept? I don't think so. I think Bolsheviks were already doing the same thing. Like, they talk to people, they're like, what do the people want? I mean, they complain about the war, they complain about not having land, and they try to take over landlords' land and all that. You know, they're hungry. So, what do the Bolsheviks do? They formulate the famous slogan, peace, bread, and land, which is like the perfect thesis of what the people want. They show that to people, and then they tell them that, what do we need to do? Well, we need to overthrow the government, and you peasants, we support you in taking the landlord's land. We'll take the landlord's land, and we'll give it to the peasants. And we'll overthrow this motherfucker, we'll stop the war, and all that. That's mass line. Like Mao said, it's dialectical. From the people to the party, and from the party back to the people. You get the sort of unconscious, contradictory, jumbled ideas and wants and wishes and needs of the people. You give that to the party. The party analyzes it through revolutionary science into a concrete and more detailed plan of action, gives it back to the people. That's what we call a negation of the negation, my friends. Essentially the same thing, just reaches a higher stage of development. Dark Color asks, what are, in your opinion, the biggest misconceptions of Marxism or Marxism-Leninism that people have? The biggest misconceptions? Well, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a big one. They don't understand what that means. Some people think that Marxism is the same as liberalism. That's also really stupid. Again, I've talked about this before, but anarchists don't understand what withering away of the state means, so that's one thing. Just to say the massive ones, the super obvious ones, is that, people think that in communism everyone is equally poor. They don't understand the difference between private property, as Marx meant it, essentially means of productions like workplaces, industries, things like that, and personal property, whereas personal property means just your own personal belongings. That's a big one. Like, people think that all those will be collectivized, which is not true. They think that in communism there's no democracy. They don't know that full communism is stateless. There's all these really big ones. I don't know which one is the biggest, but Mason Maths asks, how do you feel about the ELZN? So that's the Zapatistas, the revolutionaries in Mexico. I like them. They're libertarian Marxist, indigenous-based group or movement. There's, obviously disagreements. I'm not a libertarian Marxist, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. But, when it comes to libertarian Marxists, they're pretty damn good. Like, they support Marx, and they support Che Guevara, and all these great revolutionaries. So they're not just useless ultra-lefts. Libertarian Marxists and left communists tend to be kind of useless, and they don't really ever seem to achieve anything. Like, the Zapatistas are probably the only left communists who have ever achieved anything. Unless you count, like, Rosa Luxemburg. Maybe if you count Gramsci, but, like, of course, like, Luxemburg's revolution failed, and Gramsci also didn't, end up winning. They were still great revolutionaries, and they at least tried. But, Luxemburg and Gramsci, I wouldn't even say they were that much left communists. They were the closest thing to Bolshevism in their own countries anyway. Especially in Italy, Gramsci was like the Bolshevik guy. It was Bordiga who was the left communist. And it's so crazy to me that there's Bordigaists. Like, that's just so well, like, demonstrates what left communism is all about. It's all about just coming up with a cool sounding ideology that no one knows anything about. It's like, oh, I'm a Bordigaist. Like, what the fuck is Bordiga? It's like... So, ELZN... I like them, but I have problems with them. The problems stem from the fact that they seem to be pretty happy with, like, they've basically captured themselves a little territory. They are guarding that. They're essentially just protecting the peasants and the farmers in that area. And it's basically based on council communism or democratic confederalism or whatever the fuck these, left comms always come up with different names for it. Like, they call it autonomy or some, I don't remember, but it's basically the same as council communism. Every time there's a new wave of left comms, they always come up with a different name for the exact same thing, but it's basically just decentralized government Marxism in a really small territory. Now, the problem with the Zapatistas is that they're not really a growing movement. They're kind of just at a stalemate. They don't really even try to take power. They just want to sustain this small commune system that they have there. The biggest problem with them is that they're not challenging capitalism. They want to protect what they got, but they're not challenging capitalism. And they can't challenge capitalism. They're too small and all that. Mexico doesn't destroy them because it will be a bloodbath and it will be bad publicity, and it might cause more problems than it would really solve. If the Chiapas, the mountains, the rural areas were really important to Mexico, then Mexico would have crushed them already. But they're not, so the Mexican government leaves them alone. If the ELZN was not a libertarian Marxist movement, but it was a Marxist-Leninist or Marxist-Leninist Maoist movement, then they wouldn't just take their own little territory and just live there in isolation. They would instead be a guerrilla movement and try to actually destroy the Mexican government and the Mexican state and bring forth nationwide socialism. 2. Do you think Cuba is inching towards a capitalist or at least a revisionist state? Cuba's economy has always been kind of revisionist in the sense that they were forced to adopt the Soviet economic model. Nowadays, of course, it's a bit different, but during the Soviet period, they were forced to adopt the Soviet economic model more or less. It was opposed by Che Guevara because he was a staunch anti-revisionist Marxist-Leninist, which is why he was then, marginalized. He used to be the economic minister of Cuba, but then he was marginalized and then he eventually left the country because he clashed with the Soviet revisionists. So it's a complicated situation. Cuba itself is not really a revisionist country. It hasn't had a revisionist leadership. It's just that it's a small country, and that's the problem with the revisionism of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the biggest country, the leader of the movement, so when they were revisionists, they kind of imposed their revisionism on everyone. So is Cuba a revisionist state? No, I don't think so. Are they inching towards it? Hard to say, but are they inching towards capitalism? I don't know. Basically, the question boils down to this. Do I think that allowing small and medium-sized businesses or more trade or economic collaboration with the West, do I think that's inevitably going to lead to capitalism or revisionism, or if it's in itself capitalism or revisionism? The answer to both of those things is no. I don't think that allowing small or medium-sized businesses is inevitably revisionist or capitalist, and I don't think that it inevitably leads to revisionism or capitalism, but it has a big chance it will, so it's a big risk. But here's the thing. They allowed small and medium businesses because they are in economic trouble. They're a small country, tiny island nation, right next to the US, under an economic embargo. So what are they supposed to do? They want all the trade they can have, and they want all the economic growth they can have, so they allow small and medium-sized businesses. The fact that they allowed small and medium-sized businesses, but not big ones, shows they have principles. If they were actually just like total revisionists, they would have all out just allowed capitalism, but they didn't. And again, this comes down to what do we think socialism is? The classic sort of Stalin era, Stalin mindset definition of socialism is that if we just ban private property, then we're in socialism. Now, technically that may be correct, but it's sort of a weird way of looking at it. But that's the way most people look at it, I think. In the Stalin era Soviet Union, they banned private ownership of land, private ownership of factories, they nationalized all the industries, they crushed the small-time capitalists and traders, collectivized agriculture, and essentially they eliminated private property. But socialism is also supposed to be a transition towards communism and all these other things, as well as an economic mode of production. But the thing is, if you think that you need to be socialist, and the way you are socialist is by banning private property, instead of building something new and creating a new society, you're just trying to stamp out things that people want to do, and that's a problem. Not because I think there's anything morally wrong with it, just because it is practically a little bit difficult to do. Because if you try to stamp out private production, there's going to be a black market private production happening. Unless you create a society where socialism is advancing and creating opportunities so much that people are not inclined to do black market capitalism. Because when you ban things, there's a potential there's going to be a black market for them. Unless you manage to create something so good that people don't feel like they need the black market. Now, Cuban socialism is not advancing. Cuban socialism is trying to survive. For obvious reasons. The Soviet Union fell. Cuba lost almost all of its trade, it lost its biggest ally, so Cuba was in a very difficult situation. Now they're trying to survive in that situation by essentially very extreme measures. Now, is Cuba economically socialist? I think it still is economically socialist, even if they have small and medium-sized private property, because we are looking at it as an entire country. The socialist sector is vastly bigger than the private sector. The private sector is minuscule, so to me, it's kind of weird to say that they're not socialist anymore. So I don't like what Cuba is doing, but on the other hand, I'm not as much of a pessimist as other people. I don't see it as this apocalyptic, like, oh no, it's all over, it's all going to shit. No, I think they'll survive, and if the revolutionary movement recovers from its general crisis, then Cuban socialism will also recover to what it was, and even better. Oh, one last point. I think that opening up more trade relations with the West and allowing the West to invest more in Cuba, I think that's a bigger risk than allowing small private property in Cuba. That said, the Soviet Union, of course, also did that. Under Lenin and Stalin, they needed more money because it was a poor country. And, Cuba is also a very poor country, and there were economic sanctions against them, like there are against Cuba. So the Stalin government, for example, wanted all the economic cooperation with other countries that they could get. So it's a very complicated situation, it's a very complicated issue, but there's that.